And here we are. I'm Kevin Hill with Thomas Wasson right here. We're going to talk about RFPs, something I know you love to do.
RFPs are the bread and butter of large asset carriers. How do you make your money in these trying times? Well, you make sure that you get a bid, you bid on a few lanes, and hopefully the customer keeps them around long enough that you can make money throughout the times when we're talking about spot rates as well. So the RFP is kind of like, I wouldn't say the Super Bowl of freight if you're a carrier, but it's definitely something where if you're a pricing analyst or a marketing person or any kind of sales, it is something that you're seeking to achieve and then trying not to mess up.
It's like tax season, it's busy season, right?
Exactly.
So we did some research here at FreightWaves, my group here, Passport and Freight Intel, with Emerge. So this is Emerge FreightWaves survey. It's part of a white paper you can find on freightwaves.com, and it's all about RFPs. We asked shippers this. Right now, what's the frequency of bidding process on most of your lanes, right? So if you take all your lanes, the majority of your lanes, what's your normal bidding process? And we see still, about 35% are 12 months and above, and then 9 to 12 months. So I would call both of those long-term, and that's gonna get us about 2/3 of the way there.
Exactly. I mean, if you add in every 9 to 12 plus 12 plus, you're looking at approximately 75% of all respondents in the survey are still stuck in this model where, you're the yearly bid or the yearly round, and it takes a long period of time to conclude it. And so, especially for both carriers and customers, depending upon your position in the business cycle, if you're a carrier and you locked in those rates a year ago and rates were going up and we were talking about all the craziness with post-pandemic, you would want to actually be in that 3 to 6 month category. But now that the market is turning, as a carrier, you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm glad that 75% of all respondents have still not figured out that contract rates may be going down by Q2 and Q3. And so it's like a pendulum, but at the end of the day, the biggest problem that both carriers and customers face is complexity. You're a shipper and you have to literally think, oh, I need to build a routing guide. Many shippers, when they're polled, are like, well, I've got a handful of carriers. I've got 5. I've got some incumbents. It's all good. But, kind of what the survey data and what this stuff is helping us show is that it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way. So this is the majority of lanes right here. This is, you check your entire portfolio. Let's throw up the next slide here that shows you your most difficult to cover loads or lanes. Let's put it. What's the frequency of bidding process for your most difficult to cover lanes? And you can see that's a much shorter bidding cycle there, right? So we have almost half of carriers are 3 to 6 months. Certainly, 9 months and less on that part. And of course, that makes sense because those difficult to cover loads, they're going to be the most volatile in the spot market too. So you're putting out the spot, you're rebidding, you are just trying to get capacity and the service times and levels to match up.
And it's like the 80-20 rule. Looking at these harder to cover lanes, maybe the 20%, but for a lot of customers as well, that takes 80% of their time. That's why we kind of saw with that data. You've got your regular high volume lanes, you've got your established trailer pools, you kind of put those on autopilot, put them on cruise control. This every 3 to 6 months for difficult to cover lanes is where brokers make their bread and butter. When I worked at a brokerage as well, that's kind of where you came from a brokerage like, if it's hard and it doesn't make sense, that's where we step in, because most carriers are either out of network or it's just way too much, cost benefit analysis. And so trying to find a way to take the pain pressure out of that 40% every 3 to 6 months without having to talk to everybody is a potential gold mine in terms of opportunity.
It is. I mean, in 3PL freight brokers, that's what you see. You see you see these lanes right here on a daily basis. That 200, 300 mile DC to DC, I was never able to touch, right? I got the ones that were illiquid lanes, hard to cover. There's something special about them, but that's how you make your money.
Exactly, like Kaylee mentioned, Pueblo, Colorado. Perfect lane to try to get to coming into Pueblo, because then you're kind of customers are putting that expectation on it. And you have to think as well, transportation managers are savvy. They don't want to get yelled at. So if they have a hard to cover lane, they're going to have to almost continuously try to rebid it just for the sake that when they go in their next quarterly meeting, they're not going to get caught with any surprises, as we saw with some of our earnings
Those
reports.
dreaded transportation budget and spend meetings. I know about those as well. Let's throw in the next chart here and see here. And now we're talking about sourcing new truck capacity for shippers. You know, how do shippers source new trucking capacity? What they don't do is use carrier sourcing software. We can say that because only about 1 in 10 do that. It's open invitations to bids and that whole email, cold email, I suppose, reaching out. So it looks like email communication outbound, but not necessarily inbound, right? So they don't really take a lot of inbound solicitations and invite them to a bid. You know, maybe that's not as effective for carriers, but that open invitation to RFPs, and that broadens your carrier base, it broadens the competition to bid on those lanes.
And that's why brokerages still, especially in this space, when we're talking about harder to cover lanes, brokerages bring a routing guide. Brokerages focus on finding the carriers, finding, you know, your average customer, the reason they're doing these open bids and they're just doing emails and we're stuck in the 1980s still, email was still around, by the way, was that, you know, it's so hard. Yeah, you know, I think there was like 3 computers and they communicated to each other. So there was emails in some form.
Yeah.
But, you know, when we're looking at this, I'm shocked by the email communication of the open bids because, yes, this is the way we've always done things. But at the same time, you know, we have this technology, there's providers and opportunities to have to remove all of this extra work. And so, you know, for a lot of these folks who are bidding the lanes, who are running the bids, you know, this is such a great way that if you start looking at maybe software sourcing and other folks who have that ability, you're going to save yourself so much time compared to, congratulations, here's your bid. Here's an Excel document with 80,000 lines. Please return them in 6 weeks.
You're exactly right. You have software, you have carrier sourcing software, you have RFP software, going back to Emerge, right? You have carrier sourcing, RFP software that does everything else for you, right? That communication piece, that sourcing piece. So there's really no need. I think this will, over the years, this will come down dramatically.
Well, it's got to.
And because everyone's going to adapt that technology. Let's go to the next chart here. And this is kind of benchmarking, scorecarding, what's important when sourcing new carriers. How do you evaluate your existing carriers, and how are you going to evaluate new carriers coming on board? What do you think?
Well, I think definitely what this shows me, especially with the data, is everything is extremely important, except for right now, low onboarding time. I think that should be a little more important because you want to end. You want to get them in extremely quick and efficient. But you know, at the end of the day, these are all fundamentals. Definitely in terms of on-time service and level of communication. You know, you live and die by your service levels. Even if you're an incumbent carrier, it doesn't matter what your rate is. If you can't get the product on the shelves, you're going to have a bad time.
You are in low onboarding time. I'm glad you selected that one to mention here, because that's one of the ones that I think on this list is the most undervalued, right? It's the most undervalued. Low onboarding time, the lower you can drive that, the more capacity you have available for you, right? That's where you can get smaller fleets down into your bid, into your network, and it's going to help you all across the board.
Yeah, and that's where, you know, we still go back to the fact that a lot of customers just do not do the legwork to develop that routing guide. Now's the time to build it up. So they say low onboarding time. I don't need to worry about this because I already have my carriers. Well, what happens if they go out of business? What happens if they take another bid? What if their customer mix changes and you're part of the customer mix that no longer fits their network?
Well, it seems like a lot of shippers, at least traditionally, are thinking more about how do we eliminate some of our current carrier base instead of opening up capacity. And you know, when the market turns, like we saw in 2020, and turning right here, it can be a hindrance to you.
Yeah, like why would we limit our options with the technology available now, with the folks who are providing processes? Now's the time that you want to expand and onboard so that way you're pushing down costs, you're getting that competition, and that way your contractual rates, you don't get yelled at on the next transportation spend meeting.
No one wants to get yelled at in budget meetings, do they? Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you to Emerge again. You can find this report, this white paper and survey on freightwaves.com. Now let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back.